The earliest civilizations made a choice that defies modern logic. They built their greatest cities on ground destined to flood. From the banks of the Tigris and Euphrates to the valley of the Yellow River, the cradles of human society were founded in landscapes of profound danger. This video will reveal the hidden formula that made this deadly gamble not just worthwhile, but essential for the birth of urban life. Why would entire cultures risk everything on such unstable earth? And what astonishing benefits could possibly outweigh the threat of total destruction? This was no accident, but a deliberate strategy driven by forces more powerful than the rivers themselves. We will uncover how the promise of unimaginable fertility, the need for ancient superhighways, and even the will of the gods compelled humanity to build where the waters would inevitably rise. What does this ancient choice tell us about the very nature of civilization? This paradox finds its purest form in the sun-baked plains between two legendary rivers. Mesopotamia, the land between the Tigris and Euphrates, was a place of brutal contradiction. The lifeblood of the region arrived not as gentle rain, but as catastrophic, unpredictable surges from distant mountain snowmelt. One season, the rivers might barely whisper through their channels. The next, they could explode from their banks with a fury that swept away fields, homes, and lives without warning. To settle here was to accept a fundamental truth that your entire world could be rewritten by the water in a matter of days. Yet, it was precisely in this landscape of profound insecurity that humanity built its first cities, invented writing, and organized the first complex states. The question is unavoidable. What possible reward could justify rolling the dice against such an existential threat? The answer lies not in what the rivers took, but in what they left behind. The reward was a substance so precious it was worth any risk. Every time the floodwaters receded, they left behind a thin, dark, almost magical layer of silt. This wasn't just mud. It was a perfect blend of fine mineral particles and organic matter carried from hundreds of miles upstream, a rich cocktail of nutrients deposited directly onto the waiting fields. In the arid landscapes surrounding these river valleys, soil became exhausted quickly. Farmers would till the same plots season after season, watching yields diminish as the earth's vitality was literally eaten away by their crops. But on the floodplain, the river performed an annual miracle. It didn't just water the land, it fed it. Each flood was a reset button, a renewal that poured fresh fertility across the entire valley floor. What farmers elsewhere struggled for decades to maintain through complex crop rotations and fallow periods, the river provided in a single, dramatic event. This created what we might think of as a super soil, a self-fertilizing garden on a continental scale. The labor equation shifted completely. In upland regions, survival meant constant, back-breaking work to coax food from stubborn ground. Every drop of water was precious, every nutrient a finite resource to be hoarded. But in the floodplain, the river did the heaviest lifting. The primary human task became not fighting the land for survival, but managing the river's incredible bounty. This management took the form of irrigation, digging canals to guide the floodwaters and extend their reach. While still demanding work, it was work with a guaranteed, massive return on investment. And that return, that food surplus, is the non-negotiable foundation upon which every other aspect of civilization is built. You cannot have priests or scribes or soldiers or kings if every single person in your society must spend every waking hour finding their next meal. The floodplain super soil changed that fundamental math. A single farmer working the renewed silt could produce far more food than his own family needed. That surplus, stored in granaries, fed the artisans who built cities, the administrators who kept records, and the guards who defended them. The terrifying, unpredictable flood was the price paid for this agricultural engine. The civilization that grew from its silt was the profit, but the river's gift of fertility was only half the equation. The same waters that brought life also created a highway. In a world without paved roads, moving anything heavy overland was an almost insurmountable challenge. A single wagon load of grain might require a team of oxen, a driver, and days of slow, perilous travel across rough terrain, consuming a significant portion of its own cargo just to feed the animals and people moving it. Transporting massive stone blocks for a temple or palace was a logistical nightmare, demanding thousands of laborers and months of effort. Now, place that same cargo on a simple wooden barge floating on a river. Suddenly, the equation transforms. That barge, powered by the current or a sail, can carry the weight of hundreds of wagons with a fraction of the effort. The river becomes a liquid road, a frictionless superhighway cutting through the landscape. This was the second, equally powerful force pulling cities to the floodplain. A settlement built where the river ran deep and wide wasn't just a farm. It was a port, a warehouse, and a customs house all in one. Grain from upstream villages could be collected for royal granaries. Timber and stone from distant mountains could float down to feed the endless construction of a growing capital. Soldiers could be deployed rapidly to quell unrest or expand a kingdom's borders. Ideas, technologies, and news traveled just as fast as the barges carrying them. The city on the floodplain became the central node in a vast network of exchange and control. The authority of a king or a god could literally flow along these waterways, reaching far-flung territories with a speed and consistency impossible on land. This connectivity enabled trade that brought luxury goods and essential materials, taxation systems that funded armies and monuments, and the very idea of an empire that could govern diverse regions. The annual flood was a dangerous, disruptive event, yes, but for the other 350 days of the year, that river was the most powerful tool for building and maintaining a complex society. The risk of catastrophic loss was, in essence, the toll paid for a permanent, high-capacity transportation system. Yet this dependence on the river created a vulnerability that seems impossible to ignore. If your entire society is built on a flat, open plain next to a waterway, how do you defend it? An invading army could simply march across that open ground, right up to your city gates. This appears to be the fatal flaw in the floodplain formula, a catastrophic trade-off of security for sustenance. But the ancient city planners saw something we often miss. They understood that the river was not just a source of life and a highway, it could also be a weapon and a shield. The very landscape that seemed so indefensible was in fact a carefully engineered fortress. Think of a major river delta not as a flat plain, but as a living, shifting maze. The main channel constantly splits into 100 smaller distributaries, weaving through reed beds and creating islands of unstable ground. What looks like solid earth might be a waterlogged bog just beneath the surface. For an army born and trained in the open hills or deserts, this terrain was a nightmare. Their chariots would sink, their marching columns would be broken apart, forced into single file across narrow causeways where they were easy targets. Supply lines, the lifeblood of any invasion, would become hopelessly tangled. The local defenders, however, knew every firm path and every deceptive pool. They could navigate this aquatic labyrinth with ease, using small boats to strike and disappear. The environment itself became a vast, natural defensive perimeter, one that required no stone to build and was constantly reshaped by the river to confound new enemies. Beyond this passive defense, cities learned to actively weaponize the water. This was the concept of the controlled flood. By building a series of dikes, canals, and sluice gates, engineers could do more than just irrigate fields. In times of threat, they could deliberately redirect water from the river to flood the approaches to the city. What was once farmland would transform within days into a shallow, impassable lake stretching for miles. The city would suddenly sit on an island protected by a moat on a colossal scale. An approaching army would find its path blocked, its camps flooded, and its morale sinking as literally as its equipment. The most famous example might be the ancient city of Babylon. Historical accounts and archaeological evidence suggest its massive outer walls were not just barriers of brick, but were integrated with the Euphrates River itself. The river flowed through the city center, and its believed complex hydraulic works could have been used to manipulate water levels in the surrounding canals and moats, making a direct assault a treacherous engineering challenge. The lesson is profound. These cities did not simply endure their volatile environment, they mastered it. They turned the primary source of danger into the core of their defense, blurring the line between a natural landscape and a built fortress. The river that fed them would also, if necessary, drown their enemies. This mastery of water went beyond engineering and entered the realm of the sacred. For these ancient cultures, the river was not merely a physical force. It was a living, conscious expression of divine will. The terrifying, unpredictable surge of the floodwaters was not chaos to be controlled, but the breath of a god, a necessary, if fearsome, demonstration of power. To live on the floodplain was to place yourself directly within that divine drama, to participate in a covenant with forces far greater than humanity. The annual cycle of destruction and rebirth was not a scientific process, it was the very heartbeat of the cosmos. In Mesopotamia, the god Enlil sent the flood as both punishment and renewal. In Egypt, the life of the entire kingdom depended on the will of Hapi, the god of the Nile inundation, whose arrival was celebrated with festivals and offerings. The pharaoh himself was not just a political leader, he was the living intermediary between the people and these celestial forces. His most sacred duty was to perform the rituals that ensured the flood would come, that the river god would be appeased and nourished. A perfect, bountiful flood meant the gods were pleased, the pharaoh was righteous, and cosmic order, what the Egyptians called Mat, was maintained. A weak or devastating flood was a terrifying sign of divine displeasure, a signal that the balance of the world had been upset. This belief system transformed the immense risk of floodplain living. It was no longer a simple gamble with nature. It became a spiritual obligation, a test of faith and ritual correctness. Building your greatest temples and palaces right on the riverbank was an act of profound alignment. You were constructing your society at the epicenter of divine activity, placing your community in the direct path of both the god's bounty and his judgment. The city became a physical prayer, its walls and canals a diagram of the desired cosmic order. The hardship of rebuilding after a bad flood was not seen as a failure of planning, but as a necessary purification, a chance to reaffirm the covenant and rebuild in a way more pleasing to the gods. This sacred geography provided something crucial, a framework of meaning that made the uncontrollable bearable. It gave people a story, a role to play in the great cycle, turning passive victims of nature into active participants in a divine plan. The river's fury had a purpose, and so did their resilience. This sacred covenant demanded more than just faith, it demanded action. To survive the god's breath, you had to learn to shape it. The unpredictable chaos of the flood could not be stopped, but it could be guided, tamed, and put to work. This was the great project that birthed an entirely new kind of human endeavor, the science and art of hydraulic engineering. The first cities did not simply rise beside the rivers, they became intricate machines built to converse with the water. Every society that chose the floodplain was forced to become, in essence, a nation of water managers. Their survival depended on a simple, profound shift in thinking, from enduring the river's will to negotiating with it. This negotiation took physical form in the landscape itself. The earliest and most crucial innovation was the levee, a raised earthen berm running parallel to the riverbank. Think of it not as a wall meant to hold back the water completely, but as a gentle suggestion, a way of saying to the flood, "You may come this far, but no farther." By containing the initial surge within a designated channel, the levee prevented the catastrophic scouring that could wipe out entire settlements. It turned a wild, sprawling inundation into a controlled event. But containing the water was only the first step. The next was distribution. This is where the canal network emerged, a vast, artificial circulatory system etched into the earth. Canals were the arteries that carried the life-giving silt and water from the main river channel out to fields that would otherwise remain dry. They transformed the hit-or-miss lottery of natural overflow into a reliable, deliberate irrigation system. A farmer's access to water was no longer left to chance. It was determined by his proximity to a canal gate operated by a local administrator. And what of the excess, the water that needed to be drained away to prevent fields from becoming waterlogged swamps? That required yet another layer of innovation, drainage ditches and underground conduits that acted as the landscape's veins, carrying spent water away and reclaiming land for future use. In some regions, they went even further, constructing massive reservoirs to capture and store floodwaters for use during the long, dry season. This was a calendar written in water, a way of defying time itself by saving the abundance of spring for the scarcity of summer. Each of these structures, from the smallest ditch to the grandest reservoir, represented a monumental collective effort. Building and maintaining them required the coordinated labor of thousands, all working in unison under a single, authoritative plan. You could not have one farmer building a levee that flooded his neighbor's field. The entire system had to function as a single organism. This necessity became the ultimate engine for social complexity. It demanded surveyors to map the land, engineers to design the slopes, foremen to organize the work gangs, and scribes to record allocations of water and labor. Most of all, it demanded a central authority with the power to command that labor, settle disputes, and direct the grand strategy. The king or the temple priesthood, often one and the same, became the indispensable managers of the life system. Their legitimacy was built on their promise to ensure the flood arrived, was properly managed, and nourished the land. In this way, the control of water became inseparable from the control of people. The infrastructure that made the city possible also cemented its hierarchies, binding every individual's survival to the smooth functioning of a centralized state. The city and its waterworks grew together, each defining the other, until you could not tell where the machine of governance ended and the machine of irrigation began. The framework of floodplain logic finds its most elegant and enduring expression along a single, slender ribbon of green. Egypt was the gift of the Nile, as the ancient historian Herodotus famously observed, but it was a gift with a strict and immutable schedule. While the Tigris and Euphrates could unleash chaos without warning, the Nile performed its annual miracle with a rhythm so reliable it became the backbone of time itself. The floodwaters began their rise in the south each summer, fed by monsoon rains in the distant Ethiopian highlands, reaching their peak in the capital region by late September before slowly receding through the autumn. This was not a catastrophe in the usual sense, but a predictable, anticipated peril. The river's rise was not feared as an act of divine wrath, but welcomed as the arrival of Hapi, the god of the inundation, bringing life to the entire kingdom. The genius of Egyptian civilization lay in its profound synchronization with this cycle. Their entire year was divided into 3 seasons directly tied to the river's behavior: Akhit, the inundation; Peret, the growing season; and Shemu, the harvest. The flood was not a disruptive event to be survived. It was the starting gun for the annual renewal of the world. This predictability allowed for a level of calibration impossible in more volatile river systems. The state, embodied by the pharaoh and his vast bureaucracy, became the ultimate manager of this liquid wealth. Surveyors known as rope stretchers would fan out across the valley as the waters receded, remarking field boundaries washed away by the silt. The tax assessment for every farmer was calculated based on the height of the flood, measured by nilometers, stone staircases cut into the riverbank that acted as giant hydraulic gauges. A perfect flood, neither too high to breach canals nor too low to leave fields parched, meant a bountiful harvest and full royal granaries. A deviation from the ideal was a crisis of state, signaling a potential break in the pharaoh's sacred covenant with the gods. From the Grand Vizier overseeing the distribution of seed grain to the local scribe recording the yield of a village, every level of society was organized around harnessing, measuring, and distributing the gift of the predictable flood. The peril was scheduled, and in that schedule lay the stability of a civilization that would endure for millennia. While the Nile's rhythm was a calendar, the Indus River presented a different kind of challenge. Its floods were less predictable, arriving with the fury of Himalayan snowmelt and monsoon rains, capable of swallowing entire landscapes. Yet here, between 2600 and 1900 BCE, a civilization arose that did not just adapt to this pulse, they built their entire world in anticipation of it. The cities of Harappa and Mohenjo-daro were not organic growths. They were masterpieces of preemptive design, their very blueprints an architectural conversation with the coming waters. What sets them apart is a startling uniformity, a level of standardization across hundreds of miles that speaks of a shared, profound understanding of their volatile home. Their streets were laid out in precise, grid-like patterns, not for aesthetic order but for hydraulic efficiency. These wide, straight avenues were the first line of defense, designed to channel floodwaters and monsoon rain in a controlled flow away from residential blocks. But the true genius lay beneath the streets. Almost every home, from the largest courtyard house to the more modest dwelling, was connected to an elaborate, city-wide drainage system. Brick-lined sewers ran under the main avenues, with smaller pipes from individual houses feeding into them, all covered with removable stone slabs for maintenance. These conduits sloped gently but deliberately, ensuring that waste and excess water would be carried out of the city and into the river. This was not a luxury, it was a fundamental civic necessity. In a landscape periodically submerged, standing water meant disease and structural decay. The Indus Valley people engineered their cities to dry out quickly, to shed the flood's aftermath as efficiently as a living organism. The architecture above ground followed the same defensive logic. At the heart of each city stood a raised citadel, a massive, man-made platform of mud, brick, and earth. This elevated acropolis overlooking the lower town was more than a symbolic seat of power. It was the ultimate refuge, a guaranteed dry ground when the waters rose. Here they built their most important structures, like the Great Bath of Mohenjo-daro, a watertight tank that may have served ritual purification purposes, itself a controlled, sacred echo of the untamed river surrounding them. This meticulous, widespread planning tells a compelling story. It reveals a society that had observed the river's habits for generations, learning its patterns of rise and fall. Their response was not frantic reaction but calm, collective preparation. They accepted the flood as a certainty and embedded the solution into the bones of their cities. Every brick, every drain, every raised foundation was a testament to a long-term pact with their environment. Their sophistication suggests they weren't fighting the river, but had learned to dance with its unpredictable pulse, building a resilient, clean, and orderly urban life right in the path of its annual power. Yet this delicate dance between city and river could turn from a partnership into a tragedy. No civilization understood the stakes more profoundly than the one born from the yellow, silt-laden waters of China's great northern river. Here, the floodplain formula reached its most volatile and dramatic expression. the Yellow River earned a sorrowful nickname, China's Sorrow, a title that captures its terrifying duality. For thousands of years, it was both the absolute cradle of Chinese civilization and its most relentless scourge. Its gift was the very earth itself. The river carved its path through the lowest plateau, a vast region of fine, wind-blown dust accumulated over millennia. This yellow silt, called loess, was incredibly fertile, a rich, mineral-packed soil perfect for growing millet and later wheat. As the river carried this powder downstream, it deposited it across the North China Plain, creating an agricultural heartland of staggering productivity. This was the foundation of some of the world's earliest and most enduring states, but that same gift contained a deadly curse. Loess is light and loose, eroding easily. The river became choked with unimaginable amounts of sediment, so much that its bed would slowly rise, often higher than the surrounding plain. The people, in response, built higher and higher levees to contain it, creating a situation where the river flowed like a suspended aqueduct above their homes and fields. This was a precarious peace. A breach in these artificial walls was not a simple overflow. It was a cataclysm. The river would abandon its elevated course entirely, seeking a new, lower path to the sea. When it broke free, it did so with the pent-up force of a liquid giant, unleashing floods that could drown entire provinces, erase county borders, and rewrite the map of China itself. Historical records are filled with such events, describing losses so vast they challenge comprehension. A single course change in the 19th century is estimated to have affected the lives of millions. The river's management became the ultimate test of a dynasty's mandate. A stable, well-maintained river meant bountiful harvests, a content populace, and an emperor in harmony with heaven. A catastrophic flood was more than a natural disaster. It was a political and cosmic crisis. It signaled a failure of the emperor's virtue, his inability to maintain the crucial balance between heaven, earth, and humanity. Peasant uprisings often followed in the wake of great floods, as famine and displacement shattered the social order. In this way, the Yellow River held the power to make and unmake empires. Its fertile silt fed the dynastic cycle, and its uncontrollable fury could bring that same cycle to a crashing, muddy halt. The relationship was a high-stakes gamble on a continental scale, where the price of prosperity was eternal, hyper-vigilant vigilance against a threat woven into the very soil that sustained them. This immense collective task changed humanity forever. To manage a river, you must first manage people. The simple need to dig a canal that served multiple villages, or to maintain a levee that protected an entire district, required something unprecedented, a level of social coordination far beyond the family or the tribe. It demanded that hundreds, even thousands of individuals set aside their immediate personal interests and contribute their labor to a project whose benefits were shared but whose costs were borne upfront. Someone had to decide where the canal would run, whose land might be flooded to save others, and how the water would be fairly divided when the dry season came. This created a vacuum of authority, and into that vacuum stepped the first true states. This idea is sometimes called the hydraulic hypothesis, a theory that the very concept of centralized government, of kings and bureaucracies, was forged in the mud of irrigation ditches. The manager of water became, by necessity, the ruler of men. In ancient Sumer, the ensi, or city ruler, was as much an irrigation supervisor as a warlord. His legitimacy flowed not just from his spear, but from his ability to guarantee the harvest by guaranteeing the water. The temple complexes, often the earliest centers of power, served as the administrative hubs for storing grain and organizing the labor rotations needed to clean canals. The scribe with his clay tablet recording rations of barley for work crews was as vital as the soldier at the gate. This was a new kind of power based on indispensable function. A king could demand your labor for his army or his monument, and you might resist. but when he demanded your labor to repair the breach in the levee that protected your own field, your neighbor's field, and the city's main granary, resistance was illogical. Your survival was literally tied to your participation in the system. Thus, the very infrastructure that liberated people from subsistence farming also bound them into a rigid social hierarchy. The control of water became the ultimate tool of control. It created a dependency that was both practical and profound. The state that could feed you by managing the flood could also starve you by withholding its benefits. This dynamic cemented social classes, professional armies, and tax systems, all orbiting the central, unchallengeable authority of the water manager king. The city on the floodplain was not just a collection of buildings, it was a machine for survival, and every citizen, from the lowest farmer to the highest priest, was a cog in its well-oiled, life-sustaining works. But the river's favor was never a permanent guarantee. For all their genius, for all their dikes and canals and sacred rituals, these civilizations lived with a cold, hard truth. Sooner or later, the waters would win. The engineering was not about preventing disaster, but about delaying it, managing it, and surviving it when it finally arrived. The archaeological record tells this story in silent, stratified layers. Dig down through the mounds of a Mesopotamian city, and you will find not one city, but many, stacked like pages in a book. Between these pages are thick bands of sterile clay, deposits of fine silt laid down by water that stood too long and too deep. These are the ghost signatures of catastrophes, moments when the river shrugged off all human constraint and reclaimed its domain entirely. In the city of Ur, a layer of clean sediment nearly 3 meters deep separates two distinct phases of occupation. It speaks of a flood so immense it buried the entire settlement, an event so traumatic it likely echoed for generations in the stories people told. And indeed, the textual record gives voice to this physical evidence. The flood myth was not a mere fable in these cultures, it was a foundational memory. The Epic of Gilgamesh, one of humanity's oldest written stories, contains a vivid account of a world-drowning deluge, a tale so similar to later narratives that it suggests a shared, profound experience of loss. These stories served as a cultural anchor, a way of explaining the unexplainable and integrating periodic ruin into the very meaning of existence. The destruction was not seen as a failure of the strategy. It was understood as the inevitable, periodic cost of doing business with a force of nature. The mathematics of the floodplain were brutal but clear. A century of breathtaking harvests, of thriving trade and towering monuments, could be balanced by a single season of utter devastation. And yet, time and again, the survivors did something remarkable. They did not abandon the cursed ground. They cleared the mud from the foundations of their temples. They gathered the scattered bricks, and they rebuilt, often directly atop the ruins of the old world, raising their new city on the lessons and the very bones of the last. This cycle of destruction and rebirth was baked into their worldview. To leave the river was to surrender the source of all life, even if that source was also, occasionally, an instrument of death. The gamble was eternal, and the price of losing a hand was simply to begin the game again. Relocating a city was not like packing a tent. It was an act of cultural amputation. The question of why they stayed in the face of such clear danger strikes at the very core of what a civilization is. It was not a lack of imagination, but a profound calculation. The investment was simply too vast to abandon. Think of a city not as a collection of buildings, but as a living memory made of stone and soil. Generations of labor had gone into carving its canals, raising its temple platforms, and clearing its fields of stone and root. This was not just infrastructure, it was inherited wealth, a physical bank account built by ancestors and meant to be passed down. The cleared, fertile land itself was the irreplaceable asset. Moving meant surrendering this deep capital and starting from zero in a landscape that was almost certainly less forgiving. Beyond the physical, the social and spiritual costs were even higher. A city was a network of trust, of established trade routes, of marriage alliances, and of shared stories anchored to specific places. The temple was not just a building, it was the dwelling of the god, the axis of the universe for that community. To leave was to sever that divine connection, to risk offending the very powers that granted the harvest. The periodic catastrophe of a flood was a known variable, a terrible but familiar monster. The unknown perils of migration, of conflict with other groups, of starvation on marginal lands, represented a different kind of risk, often perceived as far greater. Staying was a gamble with terrible odds, but leaving was a surrender to utter uncertainty. The fertile floodplain, for all its fury, offered a clear equation: endure the occasional disaster and thrive for decades in between, or leave and consign your descendants to a permanent struggle on the hard, unyielding edges of the world. They chose the devil they knew because the alternative was not safety but oblivion. This ancient pact between civilization and the floodplain was not confined to the Old World. Across the Atlantic, in the vast, humid heart of North America, another society made the same deliberate, calculated choice. Long before European contact, the Mississippian culture flourished along the fertile bottomlands of the great river. Their greatest city, Cahokia, rose not on a defensible hilltop, but on a broad floodplain near the confluence of the Mississippi, Missouri, and Illinois rivers. Here they faced a different rhythm of flooding, spring surges from melting northern snows and torrential rains. Their answer was not to retreat, but to build upward, quite literally. They transformed the flat landscape into a terraced, monumental earthwork, constructing over 120 flat-topped mounds. The largest, Monk's Mound, is a colossal earthen pyramid containing over 22 million cubic feet of soil, all moved by hand in woven baskets. This was more than a display of power. It was floodplain logic carved into the earth itself. The elevated plazas and chiefly residences on these mounds were permanent refuges, guaranteed high ground when the rivers swelled. The lower terraces, enriched by seasonal silt, became incredibly productive gardens. Cahokia became a hub, its safety and surplus attracting people from hundreds of miles around, proving that the formula of fertile risk held true even in a world without written records or the wheel. Far to the south, in the high valley of Mexico, the Aztecs faced an even more aquatic challenge. Their destined city, Tenochtitlan, was founded on an island in the middle of Lake Texcoco, a shallow, saline body of water prone to flooding. They had no broad, silt-depositing river. Instead, they engineered one. Their masterpiece was the Chinampas system, often called floating gardens, though they were anything but floating. These were long, rectangular plots of incredibly fertile land, constructed by staking out shallow areas of the lake bed and weaving enclosures with reeds and willow trees. They then piled in layers of mud, vegetation, and sediment dredged from the lake bottom, creating raised beds that were always moist from capillary action but never waterlogged. These artificial islands, separated by narrow canals, turned a marshy lake into a staggeringly productive grid of farmland. The canals themselves served as transportation lanes for canoes, much like the waterways of Mesopotamia, and as a buffer against flooding by providing channels for excess water. The Aztecs didn't just adapt to their wetland environment, they meticulously fabricated a new one, a human-made ecosystem of unparalleled fertility that fed a metropolis of perhaps 200,000 people. Their entire city was a testament to hydraulic control, with dikes to manage lake levels and aqueducts to bring fresh spring water from the mainland. Both Cahokia and Tenochtitlan reveal a universal truth. Whether with baskets of earth or woven reed beds, when humans discovered the profound bounty of wetlands, they committed to a lifelong conversation with water. The tools and the scale differed, but the core calculation remained identical: the monumental effort of engineering was always worth the prize of permanent, renewable abundance. These grand cities leave behind a clear, undeniable signature in the earth. When archaeologists peel back the layers, they do not find the haphazard remains of people caught by surprise. Instead, they uncover the meticulous blueprints of societies that chose their volatile homes with eyes wide open. The first and most telling clue is the ground itself, literally remade for safety. At sites like Mohenjo-daro, the entire city rests upon a massive, artificial platform of mud brick and packed earth. This was not a natural hill. It was a colossal investment of labor, a deliberate raising of the entire urban landscape above the predictable high water mark. Individual houses followed the same logic, built upon tall, brick foundations that acted as permanent stilts. Across the world, from the mound bases of Cahokia's great plazas to the raised earthen platforms of Mesopotamian temples, this pattern repeats. They were building islands before the flood ever arrived. The layout of the streets tells a similar story of foresight. The precise, grid-like patterns seen in the Indus Valley or in later Chinese capitals were not primarily for military parades or aesthetic order. They were a functional drainage system carved in stone and brick. These broad, straight avenues were designed to channel water, to give monsoon rains or flood surge a clear, rapid path out of the residential areas and back toward the river or designated basins. The orientation of a city's main axis often aligns with the flow of water, not the path of the sun or stars. Even more revealing is what lies beneath those streets. The sophisticated, covered sewer networks of Harappa, with their graded slopes and inspection ports, represent a profound understanding of hydraulics. They were not built after a disaster, they were integrated into the city's initial plan, a permanent circulatory system for managing the environment's constant moisture. Perhaps the most compelling evidence comes from the pattern of life and rebuilding. When a natural disaster destroys a village on high ground, survivors often relocate, seeking a safer site. But on the floodplain, the opposite pattern dominates. Archaeologists find sequence upon sequence of construction, one city layer stacked directly atop the ruins of the last, often separated by a thin, sterile layer of silt, the ghost of the flood that destroyed it. At the ancient city of Ur, a stratum of clean clay nearly 3 meters thick sits between two vibrant phases of occupation. The message in the soil is unmistakable. The people returned. They cleared the mud, gathered the scattered bricks of their ancestors' homes, and rebuilt on the exact same sacred, strategic, fertile ground. This is not the behavior of naive victims. It is the behavior of stakeholders who have calculated the cost and decided the prize is worth the periodic price. They left behind not just pottery and tools, but a record of unwavering commitment, written in layers of landfill, aligned streets, and the bones of canals that turned peril into prosperity. This deliberate choice becomes even clearer when we look at the roads not taken. Ancient city planners were not prisoners of geography, they were its shrewd negotiators. Across the Mediterranean, the Mycenaean Greeks constructed their powerful centers like Mycenae and Tiryns on stark, rocky hilltops. These were fortresses first and foremost, their cyclopean walls looming over the plains below. Their security was absolute, a product of sheer elevation and formidable stonework. In the deserts of Jordan, the Nabateans carved their magnificent capital, Petra, directly into the rose-red cliffs of a secluded canyon. Its entrance was a narrow, easily defended gorge, and its water supply came from ingenious systems that captured scarce rainfall, not from a mighty river. These were cities built for permanence and protection, prioritizing sovereign control over volatile fertility. They prove that ancient societies had a clear menu of options. You could build for security, for trade control, or for spiritual significance. Choosing the floodplain was never the only path. It was a very specific selection from that menu. It was the selection that said, we will trade some measure of permanent security for the chance at unprecedented, renewable abundance. The Hilltop citadel guaranteed you would not be overrun by an army. The canyon city guaranteed you would not be washed away by a flood, but neither could feed a vast, dense urban population without constant struggle. Their wealth came from controlling trade routes or exacting tribute, not from an engine of soil that regenerated itself each year. The floodplain city accepted a different kind of warfare, a perpetual campaign against nature itself, because the spoils of that campaign were the grains that built empires. This comparative view sharpens the original argument into a fine point. When you see a city like Ur rising from the Silt, you are not looking at a settlement that didn't know any better. You are looking at the outcome of a cold, strategic calculation. They weighed the annual terror of the rising waters against the daily miracle of the harvest, and they bet their entire civilization on the harvest. They chose economic and agricultural power with all its attendant risks over the relative safety of the high ground. It was a gamble on scale, a belief that the rewards of concentrated, fertile land would outweigh the periodic cost of rebuilding it. That calculus defined the very rhythm of their history, a cycle of accumulation and loss that was written into their myths, their architecture, and the layered earth beneath their feet. But the river's favor was not a permanent contract. The ancient city builders had mastered the annual flood, the predictable surge, the silt they could guide and harness. Yet their entire world rested on a far more unstable foundation, the long-term patterns of the climate itself. A civilization could be perfectly calibrated to a river's rhythm for 100 years, only to watch that rhythm falter and change. The greatest threat to the floodplain city was not the flood that came, but the one that didn't, or the river that quietly decided to walk away. These societies had built a high-wire act of astonishing complexity, but the climate held the strings, and sometimes it simply let go. We see this in the silent archives of the earth, in layers of dust where there should be silt, and in the sudden, widespread abandonment of places that had thrived for centuries. The Akkadian Empire in Mesopotamia, one of the world's first great empires, collapsed around 4,200 years ago. For decades, archaeologists looked for evidence of a conquering army or a dramatic internal revolt. Instead, they found something more profound, a climatic event. Core samples from the Gulf of Oman and sediment studies across the region tell a story of prolonged, devastating drought. The Tigris and Euphrates, those life-giving arteries, simply shrank. The elaborate canal networks ended in dry, cracked earth. The agricultural surplus that fed the imperial bureaucracy evaporated. The social contract, based entirely on the state's ability to manage water, shattered when there was no water left to manage. It wasn't a sudden catastrophe, but a slow, grinding failure of the system's core premise. The empire didn't fall to the sword, it withered from thirst. A similar mystery surrounds the great cities of the Indus Valley. Mohenjo-daro and Harappa did not end in a fiery conquest. They were gradually, meticulously abandoned. The streets emptied, the drains fell silent. For a long time, the cause was a puzzle. Now, climate science offers a compelling theory. Geological evidence suggests a major shift in monsoon patterns. The reliable rains that fed the Indus and its tributaries may have weakened, or their path may have shifted eastward. The river's flow would have become less predictable, its floods less generous with their life-giving silt. Perhaps the river itself changed course, a common behavior for silt-heavy waterways, leaving its cities stranded miles from the new channel. The meticulously engineered urban machine was designed for a specific hydraulic reality. When that reality shifted, the machine could not adapt. The people didn't vanish, they likely dispersed, reverting to smaller, more mobile communities that could follow the water. This reveals the ultimate fragility within the floodplain's strength. These civilizations were exquisitely adapted to a specific set of environmental conditions. Their success was a form of specialization. When those conditions held, they flourished like nothing else on Earth. But when the climate shifted, that deep specialization became a trap. They were too big, too invested, too dependent on a river that no longer behaved as it had for generations. The very infrastructure that defined them, the canals and levees, became monuments to a broken relationship. This adds a tragic layer to our understanding. Their decline was rarely a story of a single dramatic flood. It was often the story of a missing flood, year after year, until the granaries stood empty and the social order built on full bellies crumbled from within. The river's betrayal was not always one of violence, but sometimes one of absence, a quiet departure that left a civilization stranded in the dust of its own former abundance. That ancient gamble never truly ended. Look at a map of the modern world, and you will see the same pattern etched in steel and concrete. Many of the planet's most powerful and iconic cities still occupy those same volatile, fertile ribbons of land. London thrives on the floodplain of the Thames. Paris is woven into the bends of the Seine. Shanghai rises from the delta of the Yangtze. New Orleans perches precariously beside the Mississippi. The reasons are hauntingly familiar. These locations became nerve centers of global trade precisely because their rivers provided a frictionless highway to the interior of continents, just as they did for ancient barges carrying grain and timber. The port of Shanghai, the largest in the world, is a direct descendant of those early Mesopotamian docks, its economic might flowing from the same principle of liquid connectivity. The fundamental calculus, it turns out, has not changed. We still trade security for access, accepting a measure of environmental risk for the unparalleled economic and cultural rewards of the crossroads. What has transformed is not our choice of location, but our scale of intervention. Where ancient Sumerians built earthen levees, we construct massive floodwalls and storm surge barriers. Where the Indus Valley people dug brick-lined drains, we deploy vast networks of pumps and underground tunnels. Our engineering has become exponentially more complex, a technological arms race against the very forces that made these sites desirable in the first place. We have not rejected the logic of the floodplain, we have simply armored it, believing we can control the terms of the ancient pact through sheer ingenuity. This continuity underscores a profound truth about human civilization. The geographic incentives first recognized thousands of years ago, the twin engines of fertile soil and easy transport, exert a pull so powerful it transcends technological eras. We are still building where the water wants to go, betting that our modern walls will hold where mud brick berms sometimes failed. It is a testament to the enduring allure of the river's gift, and a reminder that our greatest metropolises are built upon a foundation of ancient and ongoing negotiation. The tools have changed, but the goal is strikingly familiar. We can trace a direct line from the earliest earthen berms raised by Sumerian farmers to the colossal concrete barriers that define our modern coastlines. This is not a story of abandoning the ancient strategy, but of escalating the arms race. For millennia, the primary tools were simple, elegant, and local: a levee to suggest a boundary, a canal to guide the flow. These were extensions of the landscape itself, built from the very materials the river provided: mud, brick, and packed earth. They required constant communal maintenance, a hands-on relationship with the water. A breach was a local emergency, repaired by the community that depended on that specific stretch of wall. The scale was human, and the control was negotiated season by season. The modern approach represents a fundamental shift in philosophy, from negotiation to command. We no longer build with the river's own silt. We pour concrete and drive steel piles to resist it. The scale is no longer local but systemic. Consider the difference between a network of village canals and a structure like the Three Gorges Dam on China's Yangtze River. This is not a tool to guide water, but to stop it entirely, to store it in a reservoir so vast it can influence the regional climate, to release its power on our schedule through turbines that generate electricity for millions. Our spillways are engineered chutes designed to handle volumes of water that would have been mythological to an ancient hydrologist. Our pumping stations, like those in cities such as New Orleans or Tokyo, are vast mechanical hearts capable of lifting entire lakes worth of storms surge up and over our defensive walls and back into the sea. This is control on a godlike scale, an attempt to replace the river's natural rhythm with a human-made one. Yet for all this technological grandeur, the underlying objective is identical to that of the builder of the first humble levee, to safely inhabit the most productive land. We still want the fertile soil of the delta and the economic might of the port. We have simply swapped baskets of earth for reinforced concrete, believing we can finally tip the ancient gamble permanently in our favor. This relentless cycle of rebuilding points to a deeper, more human truth. The decision to stay was not just economic or strategic, it was psychological. Living on a floodplain required a profound recalibration of what constituted normal life. For us today, a 1% annual chance of a catastrophic flood might seem an unacceptable risk. But for a community whose identity, sustenance, and divinity were woven into that landscape, the calculation was entirely different. The risk was not a distant statistic. It was a character in their daily story, a familiar neighbor with a terrible temper. Over generations, they developed a remarkable cultural immunity to this ever-present threat. The memory of the last great flood, while traumatic, became integrated into their worldview through myth and ritual. The story of the survivor, the anger of the river god, the proper ways to appease the waters, these narratives did more than explain disaster. They gave people a script to follow, a sense of agency in the face of chaos. By performing the correct ceremonies at the right time, they believed they could influence the outcome. This ritualized coping transformed a random, terrifying act of nature into a manageable, if solemn, dialogue with the divine. The very architecture reinforced this normalization. Building your house on a tall brick platform wasn't seen as a desperate defensive act. It was simply how you built a house, as natural as putting on a roof. The annual maintenance of the canal wasn't a chore born of fear. It was a civic duty, a shared project that strengthened community bonds. The risk was baked into the routine, its sharp edges worn smooth by daily life and seasonal tradition. This cultural conditioning created a powerful and sometimes dangerous form of resilience. A community could endure a terrible flood, mourn their losses, and then, almost methodically, set about the work of recovery because their stories and their social structures told them this was simply part of the cycle. They were not victims of fate, they were participants in an eternal, sacred process of destruction and renewal. This mindset forged an incredible toughness, but it also contained a subtle trap, the gradual discounting of the truly catastrophic event. The daily, tangible benefit of the harvest, the sight of green fields and full granaries, was a constant, reassuring presence. The memory of the last great flood, however, was not. As the generations passed, the first-hand experience of total loss faded into legend. A grandparent's harrowing tale might become a parent's cautionary fable, and then a child's abstract myth. The visceral fear dissipated, replaced by a cultural memory that lacked immediate emotional weight. This allowed practical focus to shift toward maximizing the good years. Why spend immense resources further fortifying a levee that hadn't been tested in 80 years, when those resources could be used to dig a new canal that would increase this year's yield? The psychology prioritized the certain, immediate reward over the uncertain, distant catastrophe. It is a bias we still recognize today, one that explains why people rebuild homes on beaches after hurricanes or return to slopes after landslides. The human mind is brilliant at adapting to persistent, low-level risk, and remarkably poor at motivating action against the rare, high-impact disaster that lies just over the horizon of living memory. For the ancient floodplain city, this psychological adaptation was the glue that held the entire gamble together. It allowed them to not just survive the aftermath of a flood, but to psychologically prepare for the next one, even as its precise timing remained a mystery written in the currents of the gods. Perhaps we have been using the wrong word all along. Catastrophic implies a singular, devastating event, a break in the natural order. But for the people who lived by these rivers, the flood was the natural order. It was not an interruption of life, it was the very pulse of life itself. The destruction we see from our modern, urban perspective was for them one phase in a necessary and sacred cycle. A farmer watching the waters swallow his mud brick home would surely feel a profound personal loss. That is the human scale of the event, immediate and heartbreaking. Yet that same farmer, standing on higher ground as the waters receded, would also look out upon a landscape transformed. The ground he had painstakingly tilled for years, its nutrients depleted, was now blanketed in a fresh, dark layer of the richest soil imaginable. His home was gone, but the reason for his home, the land that fed his family, had just been miraculously reborn. The catastrophe was real, but it was also temporary and local. The renewal was systemic and enduring. This is the dual lens through which we must view their world. What we categorize as a natural disaster, they experienced as a strenuous, often tragic, but fundamentally renewing season. It was akin to a forest fire in a healthy ecosystem. From the ground, it is an apocalypse of flame and ash. But from the perspective of the forest, it is a reset that clears away the old and sick, releases nutrients back into the soil, and allows for a new, more vigorous generation to rise. The flood performed the same ecological service. It scoured away salt buildup from a year of irrigation. It deposited new fertility, and it cleared clogged channels. The river was not attacking the civilization it sustained. It was, in its own powerful and indifferent way, maintaining the very conditions that made that civilization possible. To call this process purely catastrophic is to misunderstand the ancient bargain entirely. They were not survivors of a disaster. They were participants in a dialogue with a force that both built and erased, often in the same breath. Their resilience was born from accepting both halves of that equation, mourning the loss of the specific while preparing to receive the gift of the general. This mindset allowed them to absorb the shock, to rebuild not with a sense of futility, but with the certainty that they were aligning themselves once more with the source of all life. The true catastrophe, in their view, would have been a silent river, a season without the flood, for that would mean the gods had truly turned away, leaving them to a slow, silent famine on a barren plain. This brings us to a fascinating counterpoint in the ancient world's geography of risk. If fertile danger was the ultimate draw, why didn't great cities cluster around the bases of volcanoes or along major fault lines? These places also offered incredible resources, from obsidian for tools to the rich soils born of volcanic ash. The distinction lies not in the presence of resources, but in the nature of the risk and the consistency of the reward. A floodplain operates on a brutal but reliable calendar. The danger arrives, does its work of destruction and fertilization, and then recedes, leaving behind its tangible, immediate gift of silt. The community can, to a degree, prepare for it, build for it, and ritualize it. The relationship is an annual negotiation with a known partner, however volatile. Volcanic eruptions and massive earthquakes are of an entirely different character. Their timing is utterly unpredictable, spanning generations or even millennia of silence. When they do strike, their violence is not a renewing flood but an obliterating fire or a shattering of the very ground. The destruction is total, and the primary resource left behind, volcanic rock and ash, takes decades or centuries to weather into arable soil. The risk-reward ratio is inverted. You might have 1,000 years of peace and bounty, but the single cataclysmic event that ends it offers no compensatory gift for the survivors within their lifetimes. It is a lottery where the losing ticket means annihilation, not a bad harvest. This explains why we find settlements, even prosperous ones, near volcanoes, but rarely the kind of massive, permanent, densely populated urban capitals that grew on riverbanks. Pompeii, famously preserved by Mount Vesuvius, was a thriving Roman town, not the administrative heart of an empire. Communities in these zones often developed a deep spiritual relationship with the mountain, seeing it as a powerful deity. Yet their societal scale and long-term investment reflected the precariousness of the foundation. They could not build the same intricate, permanent networks of canals, granaries, and temples when the entire landscape could be remade in a day. The floodplain's unique offer was a cycle of renewal that matched the human scale of a generation. The river promised that after the hardship, if you rebuilt, you would eat. The volcano made no such promise. It gave fertile soil, but it did not guarantee you would live to farm it. This crucial difference in the rhythm of danger is what made the river's gamble the one worth taking for the birth of the city itself. The floodplain was not a simple location. It was an entire system, a complete package deal for launching a civilization. This package contained 4 non-negotiable components, each essential and intertwined. First, the engine of immense renewable fertility, the annual gift of silt that turned farming from a struggle into a surplus-generating powerhouse. Second, the built-in transportation network, the liquid highway that moved goods, armies, and ideas with an efficiency impossible on land, binding distant territories into a single economic unit. Third, the defensible maze where the landscape itself, a web of channels and soft ground, could be actively weaponized through hydraulic engineering to become a formidable, shifting fortress. And fourth, the divine mandate, the sacred story that transformed volatile nature into a purposeful dialogue with the gods, giving meaning to the cycle of loss and renewal. This was the formula. No other environment on Earth at that time offered this precise, powerful combination. Upland regions offered security but not surplus. Deserts offered trade routes but not self-sustaining food production. Only the floodplain bundled it all together, creating a gravitational pull that drew people into dense, cooperative, hierarchical societies. The terrifying, periodic catastrophe was not a bug in this system. It was a fundamental feature, the inherent and unavoidable cost of running an engine of such phenomenal power. You paid for a century of abundance with a season of ruin, and the mathematics of survival demanded you accept that price. To build a city anywhere else was to choose a slower, harder, more limited path. The floodplain was the shortcut to complexity, a high-risk, high-reward venture that shaped the very rhythm of human history. Its legacy is written in the layered earth of every ancient metropolis, a testament to the moment humanity chose fertile danger over barren safety, and in doing so, built the world we know. The story of these cities reveals a profound truth about the origins of civilization. They were not built in spite of the flood risk, but in a very real sense because of the very processes that created it. The catastrophic flood and the life-giving silt were two sides of the same coin, inseparable parts of a single, powerful system. Ancient planners understood this fundamental equation with a clarity that can seem startling to us today. Their choice was not born of ignorance but of a deep, pragmatic calculus. They weighed the certainty of periodic hardship against the guarantee of renewable, unimaginable bounty, and they chose the bounty every time. This was a long-term strategy for survival, one that accepted a terrible price for a magnificent reward. It speaks to a worldview that saw the environment not as a static backdrop, but as a dynamic partner, a force to be engaged with, negotiated with, and ultimately harnessed. Their resilience was not just in rebuilding after disaster, but in structuring their entire society around the rhythm of that disaster, turning a source of peril into the engine of their prosperity. That ancient dialogue between humanity and the riverbank never truly ended. We still cluster our greatest cities on coastlines and river deltas, still trading a measure of security for access and abundance. We have simply swapped mud brick for concrete, believing our technology has rewritten the old rules. Yet the fundamental trade-off remains. Our modern world is built on its own set of calculated risks, from financial systems to energy sources to the very stability of our climate. Perhaps the deepest lesson from those first city builders is not about water or walls, but about the nature of choice itself. Every society makes its bargains with the forces that sustain it, accepting certain vulnerabilities in pursuit of greater strength. The next time you look at a map, trace the winding path of a great river to the metropolis at its mouth, and remember the ancient, deliberate gamble written into that landscape, a choice that echoes in the foundations of our world today.